Yes, because I got my master's 10
the October supposed common curriculum for the whole church?
Well, they've always granted us an exemption because ours and Bill's class are, what do they call it, equipped
Yeah,
group,
so. yeah,
and the
I didn't-
others are connect.
Right, so I didn't know if you'd heard about this. I assume they will send you, they're gonna do a 10-minute video every week, which I assume you'll get, just so you're not surprised. In my class, I'll probably show the video and then do something else.
Yeah, do you have a few minutes after class? Okay, could we talk about that? Okay. Hey, good to see those of you joining us online, and we will get started here in just a couple of minutes. So very much looking forward to our session this evening and finishing up our overview of a brilliant book by Paul Vitz, which is Psychology is Religion, the Cult of Self-Worship. So we'll begin in just a couple of minutes here. Yes, just about. Let's see, it seems like I missed something.
Okay,
Oh, did I give you?
you didn't, but let me just use that because I was gonna.
Yeah, I made this
Okay,
for
yeah.
you. I printed it on high quality, so the picture was a little nicer and everything, thinking that you would probably use that to make copies.
So you sent this out today?
I did. I sent it out to a few hundred people. Yeah.
Is this on?
It is.
Okay.
Filled. This.
All right, welcome everyone. Let's see, Scott, Lori, can you hear me?
Good evening, Colleen.
Yes, okay. I see familiar names. Ally, Colleen.
Hello.
Very good. Let's get started. This is a rowdy group in person tonight.
Yeah. It's my third.
We have several guests who are not usually here. So I know Cobb County is on fall break, but that's actually a benefit. Some can be here. Daryl's in town. So we're glad. I told him there's not a test involved or a paper. We can't remember, but we're here. That's a good thing. I'm Millie Atkinson. I think I know almost everybody. It's good to be here tonight. And we are looking forward to our discussion. Jeffrey, I'm thinking you're doing it.
Yes.
Okay, Jeffrey will be discussing the book, and you should have gotten the email that has sort of the summary and commentary that we can follow along during class. Jeffrey's Watchman came out today. You should have gotten it. If you haven't, it's probably in your email. And he did a tribute to Charlie Kirk. So thank you, Jeffrey. And Janet was just reading something that she had written in regards to like teaching and this time in which we're living. And it's, but God has put us here for this moment. So may we bring his light and his hope into this dark and broken world. And then I did want to mention 2 weeks from tomorrow night is when Dr. John West will be speaking at Mount Bethel on the Stockholm Syndrome Christianity. And I do hope that you will plan to come. I don't think that will be on Zoom. Jeffrey, it's too hard because I think he's in the sanctuary. So I hope you can join us in person that night. It is free at 6:30 at Mount Bethel. They serve dinner beforehand. So if you want to come and join us for dinner, and then we're looking forward to hearing Dr. John West.
So tomorrow.
2 weeks from tomorrow night. Yes, October 8th is that. And that's all the announcements that I have. So it's so good to see everybody tonight, and I'll open us in prayer and we'll get right to Jeffrey. Heavenly Father, we thank you for this day that you have blessed us with. We are mindful that each and every day is a gift from you. I thank you that some of us can be here in person, and I just thank you even for the technology that allows us to meet by Zoom, and for those who couldn't be here in person, that they can join in. I just thank you that you have given us our minds to think, and I pray that what we hear tonight, we just don't keep it to ourselves, but that we go out into this broken world and bring your light and hope to all those that we meet. I ask your blessing on Jeffrey and Dolly in this ministry. And again, we are so privileged to be a part of it. And we thank you that Jeffrey gives so much of himself, and Dolly comes alongside him, and we are recipients of all that he knows, and then he shares it with us. So again, may we be good stewards of it each and every day. And it's your day, and we choose to rejoice and be glad in it. And we ask these things in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
Jeffrey. Can I make a remark?
Do you want to come up here?
I don't care.
Come
Yeah,
up here
why
so
don't you
they
come
can,
up here so everybody can hear you? Well, good morning or evening. Historians are usually living in the past rather than the future. But Bruce has an announcement here.
Well, I just wanted to remark on something, how many of you saw part of the memorial service for Charlie Kirk? I think probably most people have seen all or parts of it, And it was an amazingly appropriate, I thought, mixture of religious and political. And if we ever needed a mixture in this country, it's the religious and political. Typically, the political side scorns the religious side and won't let them even in, let alone speak. And there we saw Secretary of State and
That was beautiful.
Secretary of War. These people are basically giving a gospel message. Each with a little slightly different turn on it, but all very clear. And of course, Turning Point was both an evangelical operation, but also a political operation. They knocked on doors and did all sorts of things. Charlie would answer questions about politics. They were political in the sense of the general idea of politics, but also their hearts with the conservative side, obviously. And I thought that was really wonderful. So this could be, and that happened so soon after his death. It's unbelievable.
They put that together, marvelous.
I don't think how you could put something. I put some things together in my life, but never like that. And it was just incredible. Get everybody think of the security that they had to have and stuff. It's unbelievable. So it was just very nice to remark on it because it was something that it's very, very encouraging. You'll see. Pray for it. Right.
Certainly unprecedented, to say the least. Very generally quite inspiring. Yeah. Pardon me?
Answered to my prayers.
Yeah. Yes, and as his wife Erica had said, a week or so earlier, shortly after his assassination, she prayed that his martyrdom, just you could certainly make the case that's what it was. He was a martyr. And she just hoped and prayed that it would start just an absolute firestorm, of among Christians and conservatives in general, who realize what a dangerous position we are in this country, and we desperately need a revival, but frankly, an unprecedented revival, because in the past, if you look at all the great revivals, the last great one was the Jesus movement in the 1970s. And then think of all the previous revivals. They were all very spiritually oriented and centered. But when it came to a more comprehensive scope of discipleship. In other words, how should our Christian faith impact how we relate to our society and culture, and also our political culture? That was almost always ignored in those previous, revivals. We desperately need that because the evil that's so prevalent in our country today. And we still have pastors, believe it or not, who won't admit that there's essentially two Americas There always has been, as we've talked about in our Christian history course. From the very beginning of America, there were people who came here to party and to have fun and get away from authority, English authority, as much as possible. And then we also had people who came to America because of a spiritual and religious calling. So we've always had two Americas, basically. But there was a considerable amount of Christian influence in our founding, and that has, of course, eroded considerably, and that's what we desperately need today. And so perhaps his death will be a spark that will ignite a comprehensive, holistic revival, which we so desperately need in America.
Of course, the church has a long history of being watered by the blood of martyrs.
Yeah, yeah. And so, yes, it was, to say the least, unprecedented. And I found much of it, not all, but much of it to be very, very inspiring. Yeah. So any other comments, anything before we get into the topic of the evening, part 2 of Psychology as Religion, the Cult of Self-Worship? Anything? Any other comments? Oh, and Millie did mention that in a couple of weeks on Wednesday night at Mount Bethel, we're bringing in John West. And let's see, I have here the latest Areopagus newsletter, and let me pass this out to you. You'll probably be getting something similar by email, but and then those of you online, I think you are all on our contact list, so you should be getting the Areopagus newsletter as well. And it has an article, or at least a sidebar announcement in that on John West, who he is, why he's important. He's one of the great thinkers in Christianity today. And so we're very privileged to have him come to Mount Bethel, and very much looking forward to his presentation. Now, the title of his address is Stockholm Syndrome Christianity. That title is not real self-evident. What he's talking about is the reluctance, frankly, oftentimes the cowardice on the part of Christian leaders, church leaders, to address a lot of these very important controversial issues of our day. And so I think if you read the description there in the newsletter on his talk at Mount Bethel in a couple of weeks, it will help clarify what otherwise is a rather vague title for his presentation. And I asked him a couple of months ago, do you really want to use that title, or would you prefer something else? And he said, well, that's the title of his book, and it is a great book that exposes, frankly, the cowardice in so much of evangelical Christianity. And so he wanted to stick with the title, and I said, okay, but we'll need a good representative subtitle. And he was certainly amenable to that. All right, so tonight we're going to be talking, as I said, about part 2 of Paul Vitz's book, Psychology as Religion, the Cult of Self-Worship. And so we covered about half the book last week, and so we'll pick up where we left off there. But you might recall that basically he's talking about how psychology in particular has been so corrupted by secular humanistic ideas. Now, this is true in every area of life, of academic life. What would be Satan's prime target for corruption? Well, it would be philosophy, because philosophy teaches us how to think logically and clearly and morally. So obviously, that's going to be a prime target for Satan. Now, secondly, would be theology. And we know how corrupted that has been through the ages. Our ideas of the character and nature of God. And then, of course, from there, it goes on into corruption of history, of psychology, sociology, anthropology, every key area in the social sciences, and even the natural sciences themselves. And so it's no wonder that psychology, again, is one of those areas that has been so targeted and perverted. And so what Paul Vitz, who was a professor of psychology at New York University, that was his calling, was to point out the secular humanistic influences and how they contradict with reality, with logic and reason, and also they contradict with Christian faith as well. And I think I mentioned briefly last week, how did somebody like Paul Vitz become a tenured professor at NYU? Well, he converted to Christianity after he already had been hired there at NYU in the Department of Philosophy. And then a few years later, he had a Christian conversion and was able to retain his position. And he must have had an enormous influence on students. His approach to psychology would be so radically different from, I guess, everybody else in the department. And I remember when we first started the Areopagus, I called him on the phone, and he still had an office there at NYU at the time. And I asked him if we could bring him in for an Areopagus forum presentation. And I was very disappointed. He said that actually he had just retired, although he was still showing up at his office at NYU. And he just didn't have the energy to travel and speak, do one night stands, anymore and so on. So that was very disappointing. He was one of those people that I would have most liked to have seen come, and so we could meet him and interact with him. So Paul Vitz. All right, so he begins the book by talking about, what is psychology and the purpose of psychology, and again, an overview of how it's been corrupted and so on. Chapter 1 deals with many of the major theorists in the field of psychology. And some of these names, I'm sure, are quite familiar to you. Now, he doesn't spend time on Sigmund Freud, because by the 1970s, Sigmund Freud was sort of passé. And so he hardly even mentions Freud, but he does talk about one of Sigmund Freud's early collaborators, Carl Jung. And Carl Jung, of course, had the reputation of parting with Sigmund Freud over the issue of atheism. Carl Jung was not an atheist, but he was more what we might classify as sort of a new age type of individual. He also talks about Erich Fromm in that first chapter, Carl Rogers, Abraham Maslow, Rollo May. These may be familiar names to you, or maybe not. In chapter 2, he's talking about humanistic psychology, which actively promotes personal idolatry and narcissism. And that's really a major theme in this book, is we have two choices. We can commit our lives to worshiping God, our creator, or we can turn inward and basically worship ourselves. And that sounds real simplistic, but when you think about it, that's absolutely the options that we have. So he focuses on that, and how that self-centered humanistic psychology, he says, is a religion. It's a religion of immediate gratification. And the purpose there is to just maximize our enjoyment and fun and you know, to use the pop terms of the time, self-actualization and so on. In other words, live your life as you want to live it to the fullest. And so he deconstructs that whole mentality in chapter 2. Chapter 3, selfism is bad science. He tells us that selfism, self-worship, is a secular, humanistic, and pseudo-religious cult. It's a cult of self-worship. It's not really a branch of science. He says the fundamental problem with selfism is the denial of original sin, which of course, you know, non-Christians in general don't want to even acknowledge that reality. And so he'll talk about that and again, draw the distinction between a biblical Christian orientation and the popular, you know, humanistic psychological orientation. Chapter 4, he talks about how that many psychologists and psychiatrists are secular humanists who hold to an existentialist philosophy of life. Now, what in the world is he talking about? Well, look, when you think about it, there's really only two basic orientations, and that is people who believe that there's a God to whom we are accountable to some extent, and those who deny the reality of God. Now, there is a third option, and that third option is pantheism, which is like Eastern religions. And it's just so absurd that it's hardly even worth mentioning. But what we face in Western civilization and in America increasingly is this bifurcation between those who believe that there is a God to whom we must be obedient and serve, or, you know, we serve ourselves. And so we call that orientation that denies the existence of God, we call that naturalism. Sometimes you hear it referred to as materialism, but a more generic term would be naturalism, that this natural world is all there is. And there is no supernatural realm of reality. In fact, those who believe in the supernatural are just practicing superstition, is what they would argue. So the problem, however, with a naturalistic philosophy of life is that it's very, very dark and bleak, because it holds that once we die, we cease to exist. And so among the many implications of that is that, frankly, we have no real purpose and meaning for being alive. And so live life to the fullest, because you're going to die. And when you die, you're going to rot in the grave, and you'll cease to exist as a sentient, you know, being. So that's, as we oftentimes say, the good news, the gospel of naturalism. Okay. So, but what that engenders is so much pessimism and cynicism that a lot of people can't handle it. So a lot of people who doubt the existence of God still want to live their lives and think, to some extent, that their life does have meaning and purpose. And so that's basically existentialism. Ultimately and realistically, this life has no purpose whatsoever. And you did not exist before you were conceived, and you will not exist after you die. But we can't really live a happy, fulfilling life if you take that seriously. So let's presume, or let's imagine, or let's pretend that our life actually does have some meaning and purpose. Otherwise, again, it's just too bleak and depressing. So that's basically an existentialist philosophy of life. And he talks about that and deconstructs that in chapter 4. Chapter 5 is selfism and the family. He says the spread of selfist philosophy in society has contributed greatly to the destruction of families. And he makes some really interesting comments in this chapter, including one that I highlighted last week. And that is, now we all know that there can be great value in psychology. It's not all perverted and corrupted, not at all. And there can be some great value in seeking help from professional psychologists who have a theistic worldview and so on. But even when we do that and we seek out a counselor that we think has some wisdom to share that will help improve our lives, we have to keep in mind, as he mentions in this chapter, the problem begins with psychotherapy's neurotic preoccupation with the individual patient. In other words, it's just you and the psychologist, and you are his or her total focus. He says, absent any representation of other people, maybe your spouse or children or whoever. So, quote, therapists tend to identify strongly with their patients. Basically, you're the one that they care about. Actually, you're also the one paying the bill, of course. So they have to keep you, happy and satisfied with their counsel. But they don't know anybody else. They don't know your spouse or, anybody else in your family or close friends or anything like that. So too often you are exclusively what they care about. And so they're going to offer advice oftentimes that they think will benefit you personally, even if it interrupts your relationship with other loved ones. So he says therapists tend to identify strongly with their patients, much as in the traditional relationship of lawyers and clients. So you go to a lawyer, well, who is he or she interested in? Well, you, and maximizing, the benefits that you can derive from his expertise, not the other person involved in the lawsuit and so on. So even among the greatest counselors, that is one issue that has to be considered. You are the sole center of their thoughts and their advice, not anybody else. Yeah, Bruce?
I sense a theme here.
Surely not.
When you were talking about Stockholm Syndrome, there's something in government administrative procedures called regulatory capture. So if you've got an organization which is supposed to regulate a particular industry, right, you get so tied up with the industry that they run you, right? They've got all the money, they've got all the private jets, and so pretty soon that's the way it works. And this thing with the psychiatrist and psychotherapist and the patient, these are all distorted relationships.
They are.
That have been effectively turned upside down. Right. And it's very interesting. I'm sure there's a book in there somewhere.
Yeah, well, yeah.
You probably already are.
Yeah, I'm sure there have been. And so, that's just a reality that we'd have to keep in mind, even if we needed psychological or psychiatric help and counsel and advice. Keep in mind that these people, however well-intentioned they may be, they have an agenda, and you are the agenda, not your spouse or anybody else in your life. So all right, so let's move on to chapter 6 here, and chapter 6 is called Self-Theory and the Schools. And I thought this was one of the more interesting chapters in the book. And this is where we left off last week. And the thesis, basically, of this chapter is the corrupting influence of secular humanistic values clarification. Now, that's a term that you don't hear much anymore. Janet, you're a teacher. I suppose that that's not a major factor in higher education, in graduate school education anymore, that term values clarification. It was back in the 60s, 70s, 80s. I'm not sure how far beyond that, but his criticism of that mentality is still every bit as valuable and pertinent today, I think, as it was back then. So the corrupting influence of secular humanistic values clarification on education. And he says values clarification calls for individualistic self-expression and a rejection of traditional religious-based moral and ethical values. Okay, so this is all about the freedom to think and the freedom to be and act however suits your agenda, basically. So it's not God-centered. Again, it's me-centered. That should come as no surprise. And among the major points, he talks about how this theory was developed back in the 1960s. I won't spend time going into that. But he says that the goal, essentially, of values clarification was to eliminate the whole concept that there are objective, absolute, moral, and ethical standards. Okay, and he says that he's quoting some of the developers of value clarification, who wrote, quote, "Direct teaching of values is outdated," they wrote, "because today's complex society represents so many inconsistent sources of values." So basically, what these founders of value clarification were trying to argue is that values, you might say morals and ethics, change over time, and we're living in a much more complex time than anybody who preceded us. And so our values and our morals need to change with so-called progress as well. They go on to say that the purpose of values clarification is this, quote, "To engage students and teachers in the active formulation and examination of their own individual values." It does not teach a particular set of values. So it's not like, look, these are the kind of values that you should aspire to, these objective values. No, that's not a factor at all. There's no sermonizing and there's no moralizing. The goal is simply to make students aware of, and here's the operative term, their own feelings. You need to live in keeping with your own feelings, your own ideas, your own, but now we're talking about kids generally, 12, 13, 14 years old. And he's saying that they need to live their lives based on their own feelings. Now, that does not sound real wise to me, frankly. It doesn't sound wise if you were, instructing 30 and 40 and 50-year-olds and older. But for children, this is just the epitome of absurdity. So make students aware of their own feelings, their own ideas, their own beliefs, so that their choices and the decisions that they can make, very consciously and deliberately based on their own value systems. Okay. So he'll go on to talk about, well, what's the underlying premise behind all this? Well, human beings are innately good. Also, the assumption apparently is that human beings are innately rational. Now, I think we would say, well, we would seriously question that based on our life experiences. But that's the idea. Human beings are basically good and rational. So the only real authority on how anybody should live their life is based on their own intuition and their own feelings. You need to be true to yourself, okay, is the idea here. So the key to mental health is self-realization and self-expression, okay? Don't hold back. Now, when the issue comes up, where should students get their values? We'd say, well, obviously from the Bible. Apparently, since there is no objective absolute values that are to be emulated, presumably this line of thought would lead us to, where do you get your values? Well, from popular culture, apparently, And so he talks about, for instance, one Christian philosopher who was a critic of values education was Nicholas Walterstorff. And Walterstorff wrote that the proper goal of the educator under this system is to provide the child with an environment that is permissive. Okay, so that's a real key, permissiveness, so that the child can express him or herself however they feel necessary. And you have no right to interfere and try to impose your own values as a parent, or, we would say as a Christian, on these children, because you're going to stunt their psychological development. They need to, act according to their feelings and all. He goes on to say the school should not only provide a permissive, nourishing environment, but also work to remove inhibitions on self-expression. And where do children maybe get those inhibitions? Well, from home, from their parents, from church, and so on. But the idea is to override all of that. Now, there's a bit of a practical problem here because public schools use tax money to advocate policies that oftentimes contradict the values of parents. And Paul Vitz writes, such a policy is a serious injustice to those taxpayers who expect that in the public school classroom, their values will be treated with respect, at least respect, if not, actively advocated and so on. So he's saying that this is really counter to, the whole way society should operate. Now, values clarification, though, became a very, very dominant theme. I got a master's in education before I went into the doctorate program in history. And I remember having to endure some of this propaganda myself all those years ago. And so the thought comes, given the serious problems with this line of thinking, values clarification, why was it so popular? And why are there still manifestations of this mentality in graduate school and so on today? Well, here's the attraction of values clarification. Number one, for students, it requires no study and no preparation. Because after all, who cares about facts? We're supposed to operate on the basis of our feelings and our emotions. They're an infallible guide to what is right and what's wrong for us personally. Okay. Number two, teachers don't have to study and prepare to teach so as to impart knowledge. They only have to facilitate discussions. Boy, that would have made teaching a real breeze, and you just go in and you don't even have a lecture to present or any facts to relate or anything like that. It's just let's talk about how you feel about such and such, a topic. And then you can just sit there and very interesting. Oh, you're so wise. You're so mature for your age. Yeah, that sort of thing. Number three, values clarification correlates well with a free expression consumeristic society, such as modern America. Number four, it eliminates the need to teach and defend particular values that may be controversial, values that may be unpopular. Eliminates that. Okay. Number five, many teachers believe that in a pluralistic society like ours, they have no right to push a particular social agenda or moral agenda, or certainly not a particular, political agenda. So I think that's why this whole mentality related to psychology and education is so popular. It's popular among teachers. It's popular among students as well. And everybody can come away feeling good about themselves. Now, the obvious problem, however, is that individual relativism leads to personal and social anarchy, both personal and social anarchy. If we're just, feelings driven, emotion driven, our life is going to be a proverbial train wreck. And so when you tell students, just look inside, how do you feel about such and such a topic? Well, there's no governing authority there. What if a student stands up and says, I hate Blacks or people of other races? Well, what's wrong with that? That's how they feel. That's a true emotion on their part. And you have no right to challenge that. What if they What if they are totally sexist in their orientation? Men or boys, males are much better than females, smarter and better than females, or vice versa. What's wrong with that? I mean, if there is no objective right and wrong, then if that's how they feel, fine, What if a student believes that he or she can choose his or her own gender? Well, who are you to say that that's illegitimate? What if a student says that, potent drugs are very enjoyable and really help me cope with life? What's wrong with that? What if a student hates Christians or people of other religions or whatever? See, there's just no guiding principles here to challenge any of that. And so it's totally fallacious, to say the least. But again, it was a very, very dominant theme in education, graduate school education, for many, many years. Vitz ends this chapter by saying values clarification promotes moral relativism and the complete autonomy of oneself. It is a simple-minded, to say the least, simple-minded, intellectually incompetent system. And he talks about how that it's creating so much moral confusion and psychological confusion in American education. So any comments on that? Now,
Jeff,
Janet, you got a graduate degree in education, and I guess, quote, values clarification is probably outdated now. It's been replaced by something else. But
It's called student-centered.
oh, student-centered. Okay.
There is value in it, but not if you take it to the extreme of what this is. But I do have to make a decision how I'm going to deal with two students who, right before the break, wrote to me. They're already dressing like girls, but they've already told me I came out to my parents, and his name is, I'll say Jerry, but he wants to be called Adeline now. And so I'm praying on how I will respond when they go back, honestly.
Yeah, for years, teachers were being wisely counseled. If someone identifies as the other sex, the other gender, don't refer to them in class as him or he or she or whatever, but just address them by name. But now this adds another dimension to that. They don't want to be called by their original name.
Yes, he just shared they had to, I gave them the prompt, but, and this is what he shared, and I'm like, okay. But he didn't ask me to start calling him that, so I'm just continue to call the name that's on his roster.
How about, hey, you?
You.
Yeah, you in the back, there, the back row back there. Okay.
Well, it just reminds me of all the Truth Rising. I don't know if you all have watched it yet. If you haven't, I highly, highly recommend it.
What is it?
Truth Rising.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. And, Chloe Cole, it was how she was feeling. And then she pretty much left her parents out, or what they told her parents, would you rather have a dead daughter or a live son? That false assumption.
Yeah.
And lo and behold, she is very outspoken now about that. And truly, if you truly love someone, you tell them the truth, and that's a hard place where you are, because who knows, you can't count on the schools
But
supporting you.
I think that's why my students like me.
Tell them the truth.
I tell them the truth. I'm true to who I am, and they respect that.
See, and other manifestations of this mentality would be great inflation and lower standards. It all feeds into this mentality. this general philosophy. Values clarification is a lazy and cowardly excuse for not teaching real knowledge and real values, is how Paul Vitz would summarize this trend. Is Janet, one more question. Is there a new vogue term for what we're talking about here?
It's self-esteem,
Yeah,
teaching,
just self-esteem.
but I remember 3 years ago, they bought me a special thing and it just went into a cabinet. I didn't use it.
Okay.
I'm not.
Yeah.
I'm there to teach English literature and teach you how to write and read and think.
Which requires standards.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Jeffrey?
Yes, comment?
Yes,
Yes, Bob. Yeah, Bob Harsh here.
I can give my experience with this as far as the motivation and why teachers would do it. So this would have been 1975 or 76, so 50 years ago. And I taught at a public school in Pennsylvania. So I already had my master's degree, so I didn't need the graduate credits there. But on your pay scale, you could get above masters. You get 30 hours above masters, you get a raise.
Yeah, specialist degree. Yeah.
Well, not going for another degree, that they just offered that on the pay scale.
Oh, okay.
What it was just postgraduate ones.
Mhm.
So all the teachers in our school were invited to go to a local university in the summertime, and we would take this values, well, they didn't call it that, but this course, and you got a stipend for it. So you could get free credits. It was 2 weeks long. You had to go every day, like maybe 10 days worth. And so that's part of why teachers would get into it. Well, this is from elementary through senior high. So as I started to learn what they were trying to get at, I think I was just aghast. But I thought I was thinking something wrong. I never heard this idea before. And as I talked with my fellow teachers, it looked like I was the odd man out. So this is elementary teachers through senior high. And I was surprised how gullible they were to do this. So I taught biology, and I think somebody teach mathematics or something like that. You don't get into the situations where you use this. It's in the general conversation, something they bring up. Hey, Mr. Harsh, I wonder about this, And so they had us practice scenarios where there's no right and no wrong.
Everything's
when
relative.
comes up, you affirm that. So they had us practice the propaganda. And so I would kind of disagree with the easy, not making lesson plans. I don't think too many teachers would pay attention to that. They were there to teach their subject, but in between classes that. Now in the elementary, I think it could be a different story. And maybe even in the junior high, it might be a different story because it's a little more relaxed as far as the subject matter goes. And so by the time you got to senior high, I don't think they had much influence, but I can still remember how awful I felt about other teachers being so gullible. It was almost like we were learning that red is green, and they were saying, "Oh yeah, that's probably true." And
all these colors are relative.
and so that's my experience with it. It was not a very pleasant experience, and needless to say, I didn't put into use anything that I learned there.
Well, I remember getting my master's degree in education, social science education, and being amused and shocked by by the thinking level of a lot of the not all of them, but a lot of the other, students at the time.
Well, I got my 2 credits and it was
These people
free,
would be
and they
teaching
paid me.
next generation. Oh, my. Okay. Yeah, thanks, Bob.
Yeah.
Okay, now chapter 7 is called Selfism in Today's Society. I'll just very briefly mention this chapter. What he's talking about in this chapter is the connection between selfism, self-centeredness, and power, prosperity, influence, and affluence, materialism, hedonism, worldly success. And again, if we don't serve God, if he's not the center of our lives, then the substitute is ourself. And of course, all of these things then become predominant. And however you can live the easiest life, the most enjoyable life, that's basically what guides your decisions. So selfism manifest in power, the accumulation of power and prosperity, influence, affluence, materialism, hedonism, worldly success. Again, if we have no higher purpose for living, then these become the ultimate standards for success, I guess, in life. Now, he also talks briefly in this chapter about a proper view of the arts. And that's what I wanted to just take a couple of minutes on, and then we'll move on to the following chapter. But he's talking about how we glorify so much individual creativity. And, being created in the image of God, we're endowed with that ability. And it can be just an incredible gift from God. But he says, the emphasis or the excessive interest, I might say, or emphasis on individual creativity is predicated on the assumption that human beings are intrinsically good. Hence, we urge people to express their potential. He says, however, in many respects, there are no standards for what's qualitatively good or significant. And goes on to say, creativity has been turned into a rationale for self-indulgence. And again, he's talking about some people in the arts field, not everybody, obviously. And this would apply to not only the visual, arts, but music and other areas, creativity as well. And he brings up the issue of art for art's sake. I'm sure you've heard that before. And an associated concept is art needs no justification. And I've always thought that mentality, art for art's sake and art needs no justification, that's about as vacuous and meaningless or worthless as saying something like philosophy needs no justification. Why should you learn philosophy? Well, it's to argue with other people. Well, no, that's not the purpose of philosophy. The purpose of philosophy, is the pursuit of truth and meaning and all. It's not just to be able to out-argue, somebody else. But that would be philosophy needs no justification, or let's say philosophy for philosophy's sake. Or what about the purpose of theology is just to be as imaginative as possible when it comes to, if there's a God, how we conceive of God. Well, that's absurd, isn't it? Theology has a much higher purpose. So the concept of Christian art emphasizes that all creative expressions should express what is significant, what is true, what is good, and what is beautiful. Now, by the way, saying that art should be a celebration or a manifestation of what's true and good and beautiful, that implies, by the way, that even evil and ugliness can be expressed in art, provided it's shown for what it is and it's not promoted or glamorized. Now, so much of the art, and again, let's take, for instance, movies or Hollywood and all that sort of thing. So much of it is a promotion and a glamorization of some of the worst instincts and behavior imaginable. And but when it comes to a Christian artist, is there anything wrong with depicting evil and ugliness in life? No, not at all, because those are realities. The thing is, you present them for what they are, and you don't glamorize or promote them, as something above and beyond what they are. So he says, I once heard oh, okay, well, this is one of his quotes in the chapter. I once heard a lecturer on sexual behavior seriously argue for the concept of, quote, creative masturbation. Okay. So I thought, well, that's a very interesting comment to read in a book like this. But there he's just trying to make the point that creativity in and of itself is not necessarily legitimate. Okay. But if it sheds light on the human condition, including the dark side of the human condition, then it can be very, very valuable art, provided it doesn't glamorize, or promote evil and so on. So why is it necessary to have standards for art? What would you say? Why is it necessary to have standards? Now, we have none today, do we? And, for instance, again, in the field of music, sexual relations were oftentimes implied in music way back in the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, and so on. But it became more and more graphic and more explicit and all by the late 60s, early 70s. And now it's just, just a deluge of obscenities and so on. And certain music styles are characterized by that. Think of gangsta rap and all that sort of thing. So when we start down the road of everything is subjective, everything is relative, eventually this is what we end up with. And I'm sure many of you could name certain, for instance, recording artists that epitomize this kind of perversion of what otherwise should be a very, very uplifting creative art form, music and so on. So it's just one of, again, many examples that we could use. When we stray away from objective truth and reality, this is what we get eventually. Just a filthy culture and all. Any thoughts on any of that? Then we'll move on here. Yes, Don?
Well, we will continue this discussion of art next week with Francis Schaeffer.
Oh, yes. Yes.
He brings it up some length, and how should we then put it? Last week, R.C. Sproul was talking about art, talking about the four elements of Aristotle's view of art, which I can only remember three right now.
Yeah.
But there were perspective, balance, harmony, and whatever the fourth one was.
Rock and roll?
One. Perspective, balance, harmony, but anyway, Aristotle's philosophy of art had much to do with imitating nature, and particularly
Yes, good point.
realism of nature. French Schaeffer talks about the recovery of realism in the Renaissance. I've lost it in the Middle Ages. So, well, we'll build on that.
Yeah, looking forward to that. Yeah, that was a real area of fascination and interest on the part of Francis Schaeffer. He had no idea what was coming, however, after the 1970s.
But one of the things he talks about in our age, which all Vitz is talking about, is how so much of art has become a bare philosophic state. Those are the words, the bare philosophic state, where you look at it and you can't possibly say, well, that's beautiful. Because it is a statement of
good point.
Psychological fragmentation,
Yeah.
or dissolution of the human spirit, or something like that.
But that's exactly the intention, see, by those who originally were perverting our culture and our art, including our music. They were Marxists. They were a bunch of Marxists. They believed that Western civilization was worthless and horrible and needed to be totally destroyed. Or as Karl Marx put it in one of his writings, everything that exists should perish. In other words, let's destroy civilization so that we can rebuild, a more, communistic, pure society and culture. And so a lot of these early Marxist theoreticians in music would argue that what we would call beautiful music is inauthentic. It's illegitimate because we don't live in a beautiful world, in a beautiful society. And so the only valid music is very discordant type of music, that really is disturbing and whatever, because it exposes how horrible our society and culture is. So, boy, that mentality that they promoted, this was around the turn of the 20th century, and we can see the eventual, culmination of all that in popular music and art today. Oh my. Celebration of decadence and ugliness, basically. All right, let's move on to chapter 8, Selfism and Christianity, the historical antecedents. And in this chapter, Vitz is talking about a self-centered orientation and agenda has been promoted by some of the most notable philosophers in Western civilization over the last 250 years. He says also psychologists and influential liberal progressive Christian leaders have joined in, those that deny the sinfulness of humankind. And again, this is such, an elementary biblical principle, the inherent sinfulness of humanity. If we reject that, then we're well on the way to, departing from reality in every area of life. And he mentions some of the progenitors of that, like Ludwig Feuerbach, who had influenced Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels and other people like that. He mentions Friedrich Nietzsche and others, even Sigmund Freud and so on. But what I found most interesting in this chapter was he highlights two of the 20th century's most influential clergymen. And one was Harry Emerson Fosdick. I don't know if that's a familiar name to you or not. He was extremely influential and popular back in the 1920s and 30s, especially. But Harry Emerson Fosdick was a product of Union Theological Seminary in New York City. Now, that was sort of the center of ultra-liberal Protestant, thinking and all at the time. And he became the pastor of Riverside Church on the Upper West Side of Manhattan for 30 or 40 years. Now, have any of you ever been to Riverside Church? Okay, it's again, as we think of Manhattan, it would be the northwestern corner up there. That's where Columbia University is. It's where what else is up there? What's the women's college that's up there? Yeah, Barnard College. Union Theological Seminary is there. They're all within just a few blocks. It's easy to go up there and just walk from one to the other.
Lincoln Center's right.
Pardon me?
I think Lincoln Center's right up there too. Well,
Okay, I don't know about that. Well, Grant's tomb is up there as well. Now, Harry Emerson Fosdick became a real icon among liberal Protestants. And in 1922, he writes a book called Christianity and Progress. And so in that book, he's making the argument, and by the way, this had been an argument that had been talked about and promoted in liberal Protestant circles and Catholic, for that matter, for 50 years prior to this, but he's one of these that really promoted it. The argument there in Christianity in Progress is that Christianity needs to be more progressive so as to be relevant to a more enlightened and highly educated 20th century, citizenry. And so Christianity needs to change with the times. Now, again, we talk about this a lot in our Sunday morning history of Christianity in America, of course. A lot of these people back in the 1870s, 80s, early 1900s, I don't doubt their sincerity. They thought that Christianity needed to change with the times. So, urbanization, industrialization, technology, engineering, all that was expanding. And they would oftentimes bring up that Christianity, well, that's a product of 2,000 years ago. And Western civilization has changed so much. And so things that people believed 2,000 years ago, frankly, are just out of date in some respects. So we need to keep up with the times. So I don't necessarily question some of these people, their motives, but nonetheless, they're wrong, absolutely wrong, because Scripture, of course, has very definite principles, right and wrong, and that applies to theology as much as any other area of life. Now, another person who comes along to kind of pick up that mentality and continue to popularize it was Norman Vincent Peale. And Norman Vincent Peale wrote one of the best-selling religious books of the 20th century. It's called The Power of Positive Thinking. He wrote that in 1952. You've probably heard of it. He was influenced also by liberal Protestantism there in New York City. He begins this book, The Power of Positive Thinking, with this comment. Imagine starting a, quote, Christian book this way. Believe in yourself. Have faith in your abilities. Self-confidence leads to self-realization and successful achievement. Okay. Chapters in the book include, for instance, quote, how to create your own happiness and expect the best and get it. Okay. Now, Peale was also an advocate for what was called back then the prosperity gospel, the belief that a life faithful to Jesus could bring material success and psychological and physical healing. Okay. Now, this was a mainline Protestant view of the prosperity gospel. Now, it's a little different from the name it and claim it Pentecostal version of all of this that we, ascribe to people like Amy Semple McPherson or Kenneth Copeland or Paula White Cain, the current White House advisor on spirituality. But Paul Vitz writes, quote, this emphasis on having faith in the self reduces God to being a useful servant of the individual in our quest for the achievement of our personal goals. So God really becomes our servant rather than vice versa. Now, Norman Vincent Peale was highly regarded by Fred Trump. Who in the world is that? Well, that's Donald Trump's father, And after World War II, selfism, this whole selfist mentality becomes more and more secularized. As Paul Vitz comments, he refers to a premier example of this trend towards selfism, and that he was a product of that himself. Now, in his time as a student at Union Theological Seminary, he says, and this is Carl Rogers, the famous Carl Rogers psychologist. He says, as Rogers later recounted in his book On Becoming a Person, written in 1961, quote, now imagine, Union Theological Seminary was supposed to be the highest, most influential, prestigious Protestant seminary in America at the time. At least that's what liberal Protestants thought. So keep that in mind. Group, quote, a group of us students felt that ideas were being fed to us, whereas we wished primarily to explore our own questions and doubts and find out where they led. So we petitioned the administration there at Union Theological Seminary that we be allowed to set up a seminar of our own for credit, a seminar with no instructor, where the curriculum could be composed of our own questions. So they want to take control of their own education, and they don't even want a professor, present in the room. The results, he says, the majority of the members of that group, in thinking their way through the questions that we had raised, thought themselves right out of religious work. They thought themselves right out of religious work. In other words, they, when it was over, most of them had no intention or desire to continue on preparing for ministry. He says, I could not work in a field where I would be required to believe in some specified religious doctrine. Now, again, he's studying for the ministry, but he wants to set his own religious standards, and he wants to develop his own theology. Okay. He says, I was one who I could not work in a field where I would be required to believe in some specified religious doctrine. It seemed to me it would be a horrible thing to have to profess a set of beliefs in order to remain in one's profession. I wanted to find a field in which I could be sure of my own freedom of thought, and that my freedom of thought would not be limited. Okay. Well, I mean, does that not just perfectly characterize this liberal, so-called progressive Christianity mentality? See, I'm not about to be bound by, some book that was written 2,000 years ago and longer. We're living in the, modern world. We're so much smarter than those people were centuries ago or millennia ago. And by the way, this frankly just follows in step with the influence of Darwinian naturalistic evolutionary theory. And that is, yeah, as a species, we are evolving, and we're far more sophisticated and intelligent than our predecessors were. We're a lot smarter than Thomas Jefferson or Aristotle or Thomas Aquinas or Socrates and Jesus, by the way. So, I mean, can you imagine the degree of hubris that motivates this way of thinking? Paul Vitz puts it this way: notice the negative attitude toward authority and the desire that individuals find their own beliefs. There was also the assumption that change is good and that it leads away from tradition and authority and religion. He goes on to say, in spite of his distaste for fixed doctrines, Carl Rogers is a clear example of one who holds firmly to the fixed dogma that modern knowledge has rendered Christianity permanently out of date. On the basis of my personal experience, he says, I would say that the abandonment of one's, quote, religious background was assumed to be a rational consequence of getting an education, especially in graduate school. So if you're going to, evolve intellectually and you go into higher education and so on, you have to understand that, you need to develop your own views on reality and not be bound by something that was written hundreds or thousands of years ago. He goes on to say the anti-religious prejudice expressed by Carl Rogers is still commonplace in the academic world. Well, that's absolutely correct, of course. Of course, the pursuit of self-gratification, the pursuit of narcissism, reflects humanity's basic problem, and that is obviously the problem of innate sin. So the question would be, why is self-centeredness and narcissism so attractive to so many people, especially to people who consider themselves to be superior? They're more intelligent, they're more gifted, they're more accomplished than most other people. Okay. Well,
That's why they think they should be
yeah,
put on the high.
yeah, they're just better than everybody else. And they have a diploma or 2 or 3 diplomas to prove it. Okay. So what would the Bible, you suppose, say about such a mindset, such a mentality?
Sin.
Yeah,
Oh,
yeah. What's the sin that C.S. Lewis described as the greatest of all the sins? Pride, self-pride, and that's exactly what we're talking about here. Oh my. Now, chapter 9 is psychology in the New Age movement. There's a lot of great material in this chapter. For time's sake, I'm going to move on, but there is one quote that I just have to relate to. And that is near the end of this chapter, where Paul Vitz writes that New Age spirituality is the transformation of psychological narcissism into spiritual narcissism. It's one of the best descriptions of the New Age, or as it's oftentimes called these days, higher consciousness. So let me say that again. New Age spirituality is the transformation of psychological narcissism into spiritual narcissism. He talks about sort of the origins of New Age thought, goes back to Gnosticism in the 2nd, 3rd centuries. And in fact, there's inferences in the Gospel of John and the Gospel of Peter to what we would call kind of proto Gnostics, who were even infecting Christianity in the 1st century. And here's a quote from Shirley MacLaine that I had never seen before. And she, of course, was a real New Age guru back in the 60s and 70s and 80s and so on. The actress, Shirley MacLaine. Yeah. She writes, "Each soul is its own God. You must never worship anyone or anything other than yourself. For you are God. To love self is to love God." Okay. And I remember, and I use this when we're talking about the New Age and our worldviews, courses. She's out, of course, she's living in Hollywood in Southern California, and she's out walking on the beach one day and meditating on the beauty of nature and the beauty of herself and everything else. And all of a sudden she writes, it occurred to her, I am God. Yeah. What am I doing, worshiping and thanking some external force? I am God. And then this quote, each soul is its own God. You must never worship anyone or anything other than yourself. For you are God. To love self is to love God. Paul Vitz writes, quote, in this sense, New Age is as old as Adam and Eve, who also gave in to the ultimate as well as the original narcissistic act, true self-worship. Remember in Genesis 3:4, where Satan told Eve, you shall be as gods. And so it traces it back to that. All right, chapter 10 is called A Christian Critique. And here again, he focuses on our essential problem, which is self-centeredness, egocentrism, and so on. And he brings up this well-known quote from Alexander Solzhenitsyn. I've heard Bruce use this quote before and all. Where Solzhenitsyn wrote in his brilliant book, The Gulag Archipelago, quote, gradually, Solzhenitsyn says, and by the way, Solzhenitsyn was raised in communist Russia, atheistic Russia, and so on, Soviet Union. He says, gradually it was disclosed to me in his pursuit of truth, he says, that the line separating good and evil passes not through states, not through nations and political systems, not through social classes, not between political parties, but rather right through every human heart, the line separating good and evil. Again, something that, people of this orientation want to deny. All right, chapter 11 is called a political response. And what Paul Vitz is talking about in this chapter is that psychology's fundamental problem is this. The psychology industry has aggressively promoted a secular, humanistic, anti-Christian agenda, which we've been talking about. It says the secular agenda is aggressively promoted in all areas of public education and in many private schools, of course, as well. He talks about, for instance, how the American Psychological Association, the APA, back in 1973, the APA removed homosexuality from its list of mental disorders and social pathologies. And that gave rise to, a lot of disputes within the APA itself. And there was a group that was more traditional who broke off and started an alternative psychological association. And again, we're running out of time, so I need to be real judicious here. So what do we do about all of this, all of these negative consequences of secularistic psychological theories and all in our schools and in society in general? Vitz writes that the solution is that Christians need to initiate more legal challenges to tax-supported groups and institutions that promote secular and immoral agendas. And it reminded me, yeah, that's what's been going on now for 20, 25, 30 years. The Alliance Defending Freedom would be a premier example of that. And all the Supreme Court cases and lower court cases that the Alliance Defending Freedom has been engaged in, and how much wonderful work they have been able to do and accomplish in terms of defending and people's right to, live their lives on the basis of individual freedom in this country. Vitz puts it this way. He says, in many parts of the country, the public schools have become a public menace. Now, again, see, he's writing, what, 30 years ago? No, longer than that, actually. Yeah, almost 50. And he's saying that public schools have become a public menace in many parts of the country. Therefore, serious consideration has to be given to the implications of keeping one's children in public schools. Enrolling them in existing Christian schools or establishing new schools will often be a preferable course of action. He talks about how we should be supporting the idea of vouchers that would allow more people of modest economic means to be able to have an alternative to public education. And he says that after all, the people most in favor of vouchers are commonly the inner city poor who want to get their children out of those awful conditions, but they can't afford it, of course. And he says these are the parents and children most victimized by the incompetent secular education bureaucracies. And then regarding higher education, he writes that secular education has drained so much of the higher meaning out of higher education, so that students everywhere now see getting an education almost exclusively in terms of finding a job. Religious, spiritual, moral, and ethical ideals have all but disappeared in higher education. And with this disappearance, wisdom and knowledge have degenerated into mere information, or we might say mere misinformation for that matter. And then I'll close out with this quote from Dinesh D'Souza in his great book, What's So Great About Christianity. Okay. And D'Souza wrote in that book, quote, according to liberal educators, the key to social and political progress is secular humanistic education, a form of indoctrination that liberates young people from traditional prejudices so as to advance societal evolution. Okay. Furthermore, the way to advance societal evolution is to free young minds from traditional ideas, such as belief in God, indoctrinating them instead in the liberal educator's own view of secular humanism. Therefore, if properly educated, citizens today can become more tolerant. Well, they're not very tolerant of people that hold to traditional values, are they? But anyway, citizens today can become more tolerant, more enlightened, more socially conscious than people in the past were. This is, of course, fertile soil for transforming education into secular left-wing propaganda. He goes on to say that Princeton University philosophy professor Richard Rorty, maybe a familiar name to some of you, a self-described raucous secularist, proudly proclaimed his teaching goal to be the destruction of traditional values. And by the way, this Richard Rorty, I mean, he was very well known back, I don't know, 20, 30, 40 years ago. D'Souza quotes, he goes on to write, philosopher Richard Rorty argued, now listen to this, and this is a good way to close out our session. Richard Rorty argued that secular professors in the universities ought to arrange things so that students who enter as bigoted, homophobic, religious fundamentalists will leave college with views more like our own. Rorty noted that students are fortunate to find themselves under the benevolent authority of people like me, and to have escaped the grip of their frightening, vicious, dangerous parents. Indeed, parents who send their children to college should recognize that as professors, quote, we are going to go right on trying to discredit you in the eyes of your children, trying to strip your fundamentalist religious fundamentalist religious community of dignity, trying to make your views seem silly rather than discussable. That's our view as enlightened professors, according to Richard Rorty. He goes on to say, this is how many secular teachers treat the traditional beliefs of students. The strategy is not to argue with religious views or prove them wrong. Rather, the purpose is to subject religious views to such scorn that they're pushed aside outside the bounds of acceptable debate. They're not even worth discussing. Okay. D'Souza then concludes this chapter entitled Miseducating the Young, Saving Children from Their Parents, with this very sobering observation. And again, one of the best quotes I think I've ever read. Quote, this is Dinesh D'Souza writing. And he's saying, parents invest a good portion of their life savings in college education to entrust their offspring to people who are supposed to be educating their children. Isn't it wonderful, he says, that educators have figured out a way to make parents the instruments of their own undoing? Isn't it brilliant that they have persuaded Christian mothers and fathers to finance the destruction of their own beliefs and values? Isn't it brilliant that they've persuaded Christian mothers and fathers to finance the destruction of their own beliefs and values? Who said atheists weren't clever? They are. They're very, very clever. They're not wise, to say the least, but they are clever. Now, apparently, this is a concept that Charlie Kirk, for instance, came to the realization of. And that is, okay, he's very smart. He could have gotten, you know, scholarship, gotten into some of the most prestigious universities in the country. And yet he would be exposing himself to just gross propaganda and misinformation. So what did Charlie Kirk do? Well, he started taking online courses, oftentimes for free,
Hillsdale.
from Hillsdale. And he apparently got, you know, by comparison, a first-rate education. And so by the time he dies at age 31, I mean, he's very well educated. So,
Larry on said he completed like 30 courses
yeah,
at Hillsdale.
yeah. Harry Arn, the president of Hillsdale, said that Charlie Kirk had completed 30 courses. And these are just first-rate courses, you know, in American history, political theory, I'm sure in psychology, sociology, and many, many other fields as well. Yeah, yeah, theological education as well. So,
The US Constitution.
yeah, their course on the US Constitution. So, boy, a lot to take in. This book is less than 200 pages, and yet it is just very, very instructive, and so much wisdom and knowledge in this book. Psychology is Religion, the Cult, and that's what it is, the cult of self-worship. And it deceives so many people who want to live their lives according to their own values and their own priorities. Comments?
When was it published?
It was,
To today, just
Oh,
today. in the
oh,
Wall
it
Street
is.
Journal, there were articles about, Bruce, you probably read that one about the higher education, the guy out in California. It's just totally. There's no, he sees no.
Working on solar science.
Oh, sorry.
well, this was actually written in 1977. And let's see, I think there was an update slightly in the preface, but Psychology is Religion, the Cult of Self-Worship. I can't imagine a more relevant, pertinent, thought-provoking book than this one, but that probably applies to most all these books that we're discussing this semester.
I was listening to you end with those quotes. And this is a professor talking about education, but this is how the far left or the radicals treat conservatives.
Mm-hmm.
They won't even tolerate a conversation.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It's disdain,
Mhm.
you know, just name calling,
Mhm.
anything but
Mhm.
an actual debate.
Well, see, I think they rarely ever say this, but they think that anybody that holds the traditional values, those are anti-evolutionary values. And if in fact evolution is true, and as a species, we're evolving toward higher, you know, levels of consciousness and thought and intellect and so on, then if that were true, then yeah, wouldn't it be a rather waste of time to read stuff that was written hundreds and thousands of years ago? We're well beyond that now. So, you know, I mean, the very definition of hubris, isn't it? Yeah. Comment, yes, Don?
This was written at a time when the humanities departments at universities were still significant in their size. But it's interesting how students have followed the money. And there are very few humanities majors.
Yes.
Hardly anybody majored in any
That's
of the
right.
humanities. In almost every university, business school is the largest. Second largest would be the technology program, computer science.
Mhm.
That sort of thing.
Mhm.
So time he was writing this, I think, bastion of existential philosophy. It's probably in the
Mhm.
but I think today it's in the schools of education.
Yes,
and the HR programs in business.
yeah.
Which is a little bit different.
Probably.
So,
And by the way, he also wrote this book about the time that Stanford University, one of the most prestigious in America, students were protesting against the core curriculum. And especially when it came to the requirements that they take courses in Western civilization. So they go around chanting on campus, hey, hey, ho, ho, Western Civ has got to go. And that started the whole snowball process. And I understand that a lot of these very prestigious universities like Harvard and Yale and others, there is no core curriculum. And so you can get a degree in this prestigious university without ever taking a history course or, you know, political science or sociology or psychology or
in the
anything.
history faculty, when I was in college history faculty, where I went to college, Miami University, about 25 professors, and it's less than 10 now.
Is it really? Okay. Yeah. You know. Yes, Bruce,
You'll probably remember this.
final thought here.
Yeah, you probably remember that back in, I guess it was the 90s maybe. There was an incident at Tech where two young conservative women, one who was an Indian American whose father, she was a Christian, her father was a management professor at Tech, and a young Jewish girl from Syracuse or something up in New York. And they had some campus function on the quad, and they put up a table with, they call social diversity pricing. And they had inside a bake sale, and so they come and I guess they interview you, and the more intersectionality and fresh things you had, the less you had to pay. The thing, if you were a white person, you had to pay $5. Some other people would get it for 30 cents. And people complained bitterly, and the police came and took it there. The campus police came and took it down.
Mm-hmm.
So they got the American, the Center for Law and Justice, or the American, whatever, the one you read.
Or the Alliance Defending Freedom.
Alliance Center
Yeah.
to come
Yeah.
and support them. They sued the university, and it was very bitter.
Mm-hmm.
And finally, they won. They won a judgment against the university, and the university announced in a press release they had won. So then they sued them again, right? And finally, they got their pound of flesh as far as that was concerned. But Ruth remembered. We had him in for a forum.
Yeah, Ruth Malhotra.
Malhotra.
Yes.
She worked for Ravi Zacharias Ministries.
Yeah.
He rest in peace. For a long time. But she remembered being taken into it before a dean
Mhm.
and being told point blank that your parents had 18 years to fill you full of all this. Put in your favorite dirty word, and we only have 4 years to correct all that.
Mhm.
Literally. And her last semester, Ruth went to classes with a bodyguard
Yeah, I remember.
because there were so many death threats. I don't know if it was
Yeah.
hard or anything. It didn't look like a nice official,
Yeah.
but, but somebody who could protect her if anybody tried to harm her bodily. It was terrible. Her father, professor, it was just a terrible situation.
Yeah, and that's at Georgia Tech, which you
Yeah,
don't
Georgia.
normally
Yeah.
associate, with the worst of the worst. When it, yeah.
But it was for the right to life, but it was a pro-life thing, and they told them that they had to be in a certain part of the campus, which was very small, and they didn't have the right to display,
Hmm.
in the general common ground or whatever. They
They,
put them, but
knowing
they,
those two, they could have had more than one offense.
oh, well,
It's very possible.
they were very tough.
Well,
Ruth Sklar, I think that.
yeah, her last, yeah, it was Ruth Malhotra and
Or it's Sklar, I think,
Something,
something like
yeah.
that was a Jewish name.
yeah, the last name was Sklar, Sklar. Yeah. Yeah. Well, good being with you all as always this evening, and hope that was, insightful and informative, educational, and you can apply your own moral standards to how worthy it was.
Can you tell us what the name of the Dinesh D'Souza book was?
Those of you joining us online, always great to have you as well. And again, never hesitate to or hold back from any relevant comments or questions that you might have. It's great to have you with us. So blessings on the rest of your week, and let's live as if our lives have ultimate meaning and purpose, because they do. And let's have as much impact for the Lord as possible. Good being with you.
Jeffrey, what was the name of D'Souza's book? Dinesh D'Souza's book?
Colleen, were you talking?
Yes, what is the name of Dinesh D'Souza's book?
Oh, his book is called What's So Great About Christianity?
Okay,
And he wrote that in the early 2000s. And it's really a brilliant book.
thank you.
Sure.
Take care. Only one more, few more days.
I think that's the end. I love it. Which one? What's the great about Christianity? All right. Me.